Listen close. This isn't some tavern tale about treasure and glory. This is the real horror of the sea, starvation. It kills more pirates than storms, cannonballs, and the Navy combined. I've sailed these waters 40 years. I've watched strong men broken by hunger. I've seen crews tear themselves apart when supplies ran out. I've witnessed mutinies born from desperation, not greed. But I've also seen something rarer. A captain who refused to separate himself from his crew's suffering. A crew that understood unity was stronger than survival alone. A moment when desperation became the forge that transformed men into something unbreakable. The Tempest's vengeance. 6 months at sea. Dwindling supplies. A disease devouring men from within. A crew at the edge of madness. Somehow, through sacrifice and discipline, they survived. Not just physically, spiritually. They discovered what the sea teaches only to those patient enough to listen. The greatest battle isn't fought with steel. It's fought with each other.
A man died today. Not dramatically, not in battle, not even violently. He simply lay in his hammock, stopped breathing, and became a corpse. This is how most deaths at sea actually happen. Quietly, almost apologetically, as if the body is ashamed to surrender in front of an audience. They wrapped Phillips in sailcloth at dawn. The crew gathered silently as the quartermaster prepared the ritual. There were no prayers. This was a pirate ship, after all, not a church vessel. There were no hymns, just the sound of wind against canvas and the creak of the Tempest's vengeance cutting through water that looked exactly the way it had every other day. When the weighted bundle went over the rail, there was no splash. It simply disappeared into the blue as if the ocean had been waiting for it, patient and hungry. By noon, Phillips was forgotten. Not because the crew was heartless, but because they were too busy trying not to think about what had killed him, too busy trying not to recognize it in themselves. The date was the 147th day at sea, 4 months and 27 days since they'd left Port Royal with full bellies and full dreams. The food was gone, not all of it. There were still barrels in the hold, still supplies that could technically sustain them, but gone in the way that mattered. Gone in the way that meant each man was receiving a ration that was roughly equivalent to what a small child needed, not what a working adult required. More precisely, gone in the way that meant they were all, each and every one of the 103 remaining crew members, slowly starving. This wasn't the kind of hunger that makes your stomach growl. Stomachs stopped growling after about 3 weeks. After that, they simply hurt, they cramped, they twisted with a pain that felt like something with claws was working its way through your intestines. But worse than the physical pain was what came after. Captain Nathaniel Crane stood alone in his cabin, studying the ledgers by candlelight. The numbers were very clear. They were also very wrong. The storm that had hit 17 days ago hadn't just damaged the ship. It had destroyed the calculations that had kept everyone alive. 3 barrels of salted meat, contaminated beyond salvaging. The salt that was supposed to preserve it had somehow crystallized unevenly, and moisture had gotten in. Mold had bloomed across the meat in thick, fuzzy colonies that smelled like death already in progress. Crane had examined 1 barrel himself. The stench alone had been enough to make him retch. 2 casks of hard tack, cracked open by a mast that fell during the worst of the weather. The biscuits had swollen with seawater and transformed into a pasty, rotten pulp. You couldn't even burn them for fuel. They were simply waste. All the fresh water barrels, miraculously, had survived. Small mercies in an unmerciful sea. The quartermaster's calculations were brutal. They were also inescapable. With the remaining stores, with rationing cut to emergency levels, they could stretch supplies for another 8 weeks if nobody got sick and nothing else went wrong. 8 weeks. But the nearest reliable port, one not controlled by the Royal Navy and not occupied by rival pirate crews, was nearly 4 months away. Crane did the math that no captain wanted to do. 1 month with almost nothing. 1 month where the crew would be existing on water and whatever they could catch from the sea, assuming they could catch anything at all. 1 month where men would begin, seriously begin, to consider things they'd never considered before. Mutiny was the obvious choice. It was also the most likely outcome. Crane poured rum into a glass, not the weak stuff the crew drank, but the real thing, kept in the captain's stores for exactly this kind of moment. He drank it without tasting it, which meant the alcohol barely registered. He was, at that moment, a man doing calculations about death. His own death, his crew's death, the death of everything he'd built and maintained for the past 3 decades at sea. It started in week 1 after the storm. A crew member named Davies, a man who'd been with Crane for 5 years, who'd never complained about anything except the quality of the ship's rum, came to the ship's doctor with his hands held out, almost apologetically. The skin was wrong, covered in strange discolorations, deep purple and green spreading across his palms like continents appearing on a map. When the doctor pressed on the marks, they didn't fade, they didn't change. The doctor was a man named Finch, who'd learned medicine mostly through trial and error in ports around the Caribbean. He'd seen many things, but he'd only seen this a few times before, and each time the prognosis had been the same. Finch didn't need to say anything. Davies already knew. By week 2 it was spreading. A man named Hawkins reported that his gums were bleeding when he tried to eat. The blood mixed with food and saliva until he spat pink into his palm. A sailor named Porter came complaining that an old wound, a knife scar from a fight years ago, had begun weeping blood again, as if the injury was happening all over again, decades later. The scurvy was moving through the crew with the speed and inevitability of a plague. What made it worse was that it was invisible until it wasn't. A man could seem perfectly fine one day, and then the next day his teeth would be loose in his jaw. A man could walk upright one morning and by evening be unable to move because every joint in his body had become a source of blinding pain. The disease didn't kill you quickly enough to be merciful. It killed you slowly, methodically, stripping away function and dignity day by day. By the end of week 3, 7 men were confined to their hammocks. They couldn't work, they could barely move. Most of the time, they just lay in the dark, waiting for something to change, waiting for death, mostly. The crew had begun to split. Some men seemed to be developing the disease quickly. Others inexplicably seemed resistant. Finch had no explanation. Neither did anyone else. The truth, which wouldn't be understood for another 50 years, was vitamin C. The crew had no fruit, no fresh vegetables, nothing with the ascorbic acid that kept the human body from eating itself. But knowledge of this was a century away. Right now, it was just a mystery, a death that came from no sword, no disease vector, no visible cause. Just decay, literally, from the inside out. The moment came unexpectedly, as these moments often do. It was during the daily ration distribution. The quartermaster was measuring out each man's portion, a pound of salted meat that looked less like food and more like something you'd use to repair a boat, a piece of hardtack that required soaking for 3 hours before it became edible, and a single quart of water. One of the newer crew members, a man no more than 20 years old named Garrett, took his portion and then turned to stare at the barrels. The empty barrels. The barrels that would all be empty in 3 weeks, maybe less. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. But something in his stance, something in the way he looked at the diminishing stores, communicated a question that every man aboard was thinking. What happens when these barrels are empty? The crew stood in silence. Not shocked silence, expectant silence, the silence of men who'd been waiting for someone else to voice the thought they all shared. Garrett wasn't particularly brave or particularly stupid. He was just hungry. And hunger has a way of stripping away social niceties. He walked to the center of the gathered crew and spoke words that cut through the air like a knife. A single question about what the captain's plan was, asked in a voice that suggested the answer would determine everything that came next. Crane was below decks when the commotion started. He knew what was happening without needing to see it. After 30 years at sea, he could feel mutiny the way a storm at sea can feel the change in wind pressure. By the time he reached the deck, Garrett had been joined by 4 other men. Not yet an active mutiny. They weren't threatening violence or demanding anything specific. They were just standing together, a unit of doubt and hunger made flesh. Crane moved forward without hesitation, without fear. This was the moment that determined everything. This was the moment where a captain either seized control or lost it forever. He didn't address the mutineers directly. Instead, he walked to the quartermaster's table, removed his own ration from the supplies, and held it up to the light. The salted meat, hard and grey and completely unappetizing. The hard tack, rock solid and covered in a fine layer of salt crystals. Then, without ceremony, he consumed it. Not theatrically, not with grand gestures, just methodically, the way a man eats when he's making a point that goes beyond words. He bit into the hard tack, waited for his jaw to work through the hardness, and swallowed. He tore into the meat, which immediately began coating his mouth with salt, and kept eating. The crew watched. What Crane understood, what very few commanders ever understood, was that leadership in moments of desperation isn't about eloquence. It's about demonstration. It's about showing that you're not separate from the suffering, that you're not elevated above the hunger. When he finished eating the same ration every man received, he turned to the crew and, without words, walked to the navigation charts. He marked their current position, marked the nearest port where they might resupply, and marked the distance between the two. Then he made a calculation on the ship's log and held it up. The mathematics were clear enough that no one needed him to explain them. They had enough supplies to reach the port. It would require discipline. It would require unity. It would require every man to trust that the captain wasn't lying about their odds. But it could be done. Garrett's face went through several expressions before settling on something that might have been shame or might have been relief. The other 4 men who'd been standing with him quietly returned to their duties. The crisis had been averted. Not solved, but averted. 3 days later, a sail appeared on the horizon. Not a warship. The crew had learned to recognize those by their silhouettes. This was a merchant vessel, riding low in the water, which meant a full hold. The crew moved into action with the efficiency of men who'd been waiting for exactly this opportunity. Cannons were positioned, the Jolly Roger was raised, the ship was set on an intercept course. What happened next was beautiful in its own terrible way. The merchant captain, seeing the pirate flag and the clearly experienced crew, made an economic decision. He knew that fighting meant casualties, meant potential death, meant his cargo destroyed. Surrendering meant he lived, his crew lived, and they reported the loss to insurance agents back in Europe. He surrendered without firing a shot. The pirate crew boarded the merchant vessel and found what amounted to a floating supermarket. Barrels of salted cod, enough to feed 3 ships for 2 months. Sacks of flour, tightly sealed, untouched by moisture or weevils. Wheels of cheese, harder than stone but absolutely preserved. Crates of dried fruits, apples, pears, plums, that had been locked away from the elements. And then, in a specialized hold, something that made the crew stop moving entirely. Barrels of lime preserves. Not fresh limes, but preserved ones. Limes that had been packed in their own juice and sealed tight against spoilage. The crew didn't cheer. They were too professional for that, too experienced in the ways of pirate conduct. But something happened anyway, something internal and powerful. The understanding that they would survive, that the choice to trust the captain, to maintain discipline, to believe in the mathematics of the voyage, that choice had been vindicated. The transfer of supplies took 8 hours. By the time the Tempest's vengeance was loaded with its acquired fortune, the sun was setting. The crew moved below decks in silence, not because they were sad, but because they were processing the reality of continued existence. What happened next could only be described as transformation. The lime preserves that had seemed like just another cargo item turned out to be salvation in concentrated form. The ship's cook, a man named Willem, who'd been serving on pirate vessels for 20 years, began incorporating them into every meal with the intensity of a man who knew he was fighting death itself. Within 3 days of consuming citrus regularly, the crew members showing signs of scurvy began to stabilize. The bleeding gums stopped getting worse. The old wounds stopped weeping blood. The joints, while still sore, stopped inflaming so violently. By day 7, Davies, the man who'd first shown the discoloring, was able to move with only minor pain. By day 10, he was working the sails again. The physical recovery was remarkable, but it was the psychological shift that was truly extraordinary. The crew had endured something together. They'd faced starvation, disease, the possibility of mutiny, and the mathematical certainty that they might all die. And they'd survived through a combination of leadership that didn't demand special privileges, crew discipline that held even when everything suggested breaking, and a single act of violence against a merchant vessel that provided the resources needed to continue. They understood now, in a way that only experience could teach them, that survival wasn't about comfortable circumstances. It was about adaptation. It was about finding resources where resources seemed not to exist. It was about the willingness to take what was needed when there was no other option. But more than that, they understood something deeper, that a crew unified by shared suffering and shared success was something stronger than any formal hierarchy. By the time the Tempest's Vengeance pulled into port 63 days later, something had changed about the crew that couldn't be erased by simple rest or fresh supplies. They moved like soldiers who'd survived a war. They carried themselves with the confidence of men who'd looked into an abyss and decided not to blink. Other crews in the port could feel it immediately. The men from the Tempest's Vengeance had something different, some quality that marked them as survivors of something beyond the normal scope of pirate experience. They'd discovered something crucial during those 6 months, that a captain willing to eat the same rations as his crew, a crew willing to trust that captain despite every instinct suggesting betrayal, and a system of discipline that treated survival as a collective rather than an individual concern. These things created something almost unbreakable. The ration system that Crane had implemented remained in place throughout the rest of his seafaring career. Other captains heard about it, studied it, attempted to copy it. Few succeeded because most captains couldn't bring themselves to give up their privileges. Most crews couldn't bring themselves to trust leadership that seemed to require such sacrifice. But the ones that did, the ships that adopted versions of Crane's system, were notably more successful. They had lower mortality rates. They had longer voyages without mutiny. They had crews that remained cohesive even in the worst circumstances. The practical innovations mattered too. The understanding of fishing techniques, the knowledge of which preservation methods actually worked, the recognition that citrus prevented scurvy, these things spread through the pirate community like folklore. Younger crews sought out veterans who'd sailed on the Tempest's Vengeance specifically to learn their methods. 20 years later, long after Captain Crane had retired to Tortuga and died of natural causes, a rarity for a pirate captain, a ship's historian was compiling records of the major pirate voyages of the era. He found reference to the Tempest's Vengeance and its 6-month voyage, but most of the details were fragmentary. Legends mostly passed down through the pirate community like sacred texts. A crew that had faced starvation and disease and survived. A captain who'd refused to accept the traditional perquisites of command. A moment where mutiny threatened and was averted not through violence, but through simple, stark demonstration of shared sacrifice. The historian tried to track down surviving crew members. Most were either dead or scattered across the Caribbean and beyond. But he did find one man, an ancient sailor named Thomas, who'd kept a journal throughout his entire life at sea. Thomas's journal didn't contain elaborate strategic discussions or complex philosophical observations. It was mostly just records of daily events, the weather, what they ate, who died, who recovered. Simple observations of survival. But woven through it was something else entirely. A record of how a crew had been transformed by necessity and united by the refusal of their captain to distance himself from their suffering. The final entry in Thomas's journal, written decades after the voyage had ended, contained a single line that the historian would quote for the rest of his life. "We learned that surviving together is stronger than ruling alone." The romantic image of piracy, the treasure maps, the buried gold, the dramatic sword fights, is mostly fiction created by people who've never actually been to sea. The real horror of piracy, the thing that actually killed men, was simpler and more terrible. The ocean itself, which demanded respect, supplies, and constant adaptation. The men who survived were rarely the ones with the most gold or the most impressive weapons. They were the ones who understood that survival required 3 things: a system that worked, discipline that could bend without breaking, and leadership that refused to separate itself from the suffering of those it commanded. Captain Nathaniel Crane and the crew of the Tempest's Vengeance weren't heroes in the traditional sense. They were simply men facing impossible circumstances who made the choices that allowed them to continue existing. But in a harsh and unforgiving world, sometimes that's what heroism actually looks like. Not grand gestures, not dramatic speeches, just the daily choice to continue forward when everything suggests stopping. Just the willingness to share equally in suffering. Just the understanding that you're stronger with others than you are alone. The ocean doesn't care about your pride or your rank or your personal comfort. It only recognizes one thing: the ability to adapt, to persist, and to understand that survival is a collective endeavor. The Tempest's vengeance survived because it learned that lesson before it was too late.